What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Taco Garage, and today in the shop we have this brand new Land Cruiser. Not even plates on it, but of course we're lifting it because that's what you do when you have a Land Cruiser like this one. This is the first time I see the cloth seats on the Land Cruiser. I've seen the leather, but these cloth seats are interesting. It's kind of a cool fabric here. Oh, there's also this light up Toyota logo here that I hadn't seen before on the other Land Cruisers that we've worked on. So this is what we're actually doing. We're gonna remove the shock, put some spacers on top, and then in the back, we're gonna put some spacers on top of the spring. No shocks today, no upper control arms, none of that fancy stuff. We're just gonna stick to spacers for now, and these are provided by READYLIFT. This is a READYLIFT. This is the part number in case you're curious, and we got all these parts. This is the rear spacer that's gonna sit on top of the rear spring. This is the front spacer. This is gonna sit on top of the front strut assembly. And then this is a preload spacer. That's gonna go in between the spring and the top hat. That's gonna give it a little preload in combination with this spacer. That's what's gonna get us the lift that we want. Now, because of how this spacer works, there we go. It's gonna change our bolt pattern and it's gonna rotate it 45 degrees. So we're gonna have to adjust, put it on the spring compressor and adjust a little bit for that. I'll show you how to do that later. And we're gonna have to cut this bolt short a little bit so it can actually sit on the shock tower properly. We also have spacers for the little bump stop that we have right here, but size doesn't matter, right? And then we have our paint matched bump stops. Brackets to mount the bump stops on. And that's pretty much it. I already took one of the shocks out to kind of show you how this is gonna go. And we're gonna get started on the second one. I already made a video on how to remove the shocks for the Land Cruiser when we were doing the King shocks. This is obviously gonna be a little bit different, but the removal part is sort of the same, so I don't wanna go through the whole process step by step, but I'm just gonna point things out and make sure it's still easier to follow. But I don't want to do just step by step. Also, we're kind of a little tight on time, so that's the reason. But what we're going to do is remove all these 12mm bolts, anything that creates slack in between, slack on these brake lines and the ABS wire here. You want to make sure that you're not pulling any of these. And then we're going to do the top 4 shock bolts and the bottom bolt. And I think that alone is going to allow us to remove the shock. We may need to undo the tie rod and the ball joint over here, but we're not gonna do anything we don't need to do yet. So I'm just gonna undo the top 4, bottom, and we may be able to get the shock out just like that. If not, then we'll start removing other stuff. Now that the shock is off, we have better access to the bump stop. So definitely let's do that now before it gets more complicated. Or we forget and we put the shock back on and then we have a little bit more of a problem doing that. So let's do that now. So we got the bump stop out. It's actually super tight. I ended up using this wrench to remove it. This might be a little overkill, but it was still not easy. So with the bump stop removed, we are gonna have to cut a little bit of the stud here. We want it to go into the spacer about halfway through the spacer because the other half will be taken up by the new stud that we're gonna install on it so that we can install it back on the truck. So I think the instructions say about 1/4 inch length on that stud and the bump stop. So let's do that. And now this will go straight back in here. Once the shocks are all put together, we're gonna have to lower the control arm to make some space to put it back in. It's easy to take it out without removing anything else, but to put it back in, it's just not gonna fit if we don't loosen this situation here a little bit. So what we're gonna do is lower the control arm. We're gonna loosen this bolt over here, and obviously the cam bolts. The control arm's gonna slide down. At this point, we already have the sway bar disconnected, which would be the one other thing keeping the lower control arm up. So Now that that's not a factor, we're just gonna do these two. The lower control arm is gonna swing down, and to get to the lower control arm, we need to remove the skid plate as well. So we're gonna do that now. These should be for 12 mil, right here, here, and here. So now that we have the control arm down like that, we have all the space in the world right here to just slide our shock all the way back up. And if you haven't, it's a good time to put the spacer in the bump stop, because right now you have full access to it. You could even get it with a socket if you have a big enough socket, with any wrench. Like, you have all the space in the world to do that right now. Okay, so now we're ready to disassemble the shock and put everything together, the spacer, the other spacer, and then everything together before it goes back in the truck. Now, there's a couple things you need to do before we get to that point. One, the spacer on top, as you can see, it has a little excess bolt that goes past the spacer. We can't have that, so we're gonna have to cut all the bolts to right around here. You just want to make sure that it doesn't go past this plate, otherwise it's going to obstruct. It's not going to sit right on the shock tower. But as long as you cut it anywhere before here, and obviously you want the nuts to fully engage on the stud. So those two things can easily happen at the same time, so just make sure that you cut at the right spot. You have this amount of stud that you can cut off. So if it's a little more, a little less, that's totally fine. But try to make sure that the nut engages fully and that the stud is not going past this plate. That's all the requirements. You can go anywhere in between, and that's totally fine. Now, next thing you want to do, because of how this spacer works, obviously the bolts, the factory bolts are going to go in here, so it's going to rotate the whole pattern on top. So the whole shock is going to get rotated, so you have to compensate for that. You have to rotate the shock as you have it on the compressor. You have to rotate the shock so that this aligns with the new pattern, with the new angle on the spacer. So one way to keep everything lined up is making some marks, obviously. So if you draw a line between these two bolts, specifically these two, it's going to be perpendicular to the eyelet where it's at right now, and that's how it fits on the truck. So if you identify the equivalent to these two, which would be not these, not these, not these, these. Okay, so these are going to be at the end in the same direction these are. So the holes where these would be, these are not going to be there. So we apply the same logic to that. So these two, you draw a line between them, and it should be perpendicular to that. So we put this back on the shock. These are the two bolts that we identified a second ago. Draw a line between them, and it should be perpendicular to that. So once we put this on the compressor, we're going to have to rotate this top hat this way so that it's perpendicular to the shock bolt. I hope that's kind of clear, but I'll still show you once we're on the compressor. I got the spring on the spring compressor now, and the shock is disassembled. So now we're going to take everything apart. We want to take this boot out, just pull it. It's smooth on the side, so it just basically pushes in and pushes and it pulls out. I'm going to take the rubber. There we go. It does have a little bit of a lip here, so you kind of have to fight it. And then this goes right in there. The seat does not go through the boot. So you want to make sure that you do the isolator first, and then you can slide the boot on top. For this one, you will need something to push it down with, unless you can fit your hand in there, but not my case. So I'm going to use this. You're all set. Now we take it back to the spring compressor, put it all together. This is how it's going to look. So kind of hard to tell here, but that's my mark. These are the two bolts, the reference bolts that we used earlier. So draw a line between them, and it should be perpendicular to the shock bolt, or actually parallel to the shock bolt, perpendicular to the eyelet. And that is about right. Obviously, it's harder to see on camera, but that should be about right, and we're gonna go test it out on the truck. And it should line up pretty well with the bottom. There we go. And that looks about right. So once we bring the lower control arm back up, this should line up pretty well. As you can see, nice. Not gonna lie, I was a little worried that my logic there was flawed, but it wasn't, and there's evidence right there. Now that the shock is fully assembled, everything lines up and it's back on the truck, we want to button everything up. Also, torque specs are on the instruction sheet, so make sure you look at that for all the torque specs. When connecting the sway bar, it's actually a lot easier if you disconnect it from the top, put this bolt in, and then connect it back into the sway bar. Okay, so the front end is now all buttoned up and all finished. We have everything torqued down, except of course for the cam bolts, which need to be torqued down once the car sits on the ground. And then of course it's gonna get moved again once the alignment gets done, but that's a whole nother thing. We're not dealing with that right now. Everything else is torqued down, the top bolts, the shock bolt, these two down here. We did not move the tie rods, we did not remove the ball joints. Sway bar is back on as well. So we're ready to move to the back, and this is the back spacer. It's pretty beefy, and it comes with a replacement bump stop as well. This is the paint matched bump stop, which of course this is not paint matched. It just happens to be black. If anyone was confused, I hope that was very obvious. So here on the backside, we're just gonna remove the bottom shock bolts. We're gonna loosen this, not take it off, but we're just gonna loosen it up. And we're gonna undo the sway bar as well. That's gonna allow the axle to come down a little bit. On this side, it does get a little trickier. I kind of cheated again, and I did this ahead of time. This is what the bump stop's gonna look like. Spacer's already over there. There we go. So spacer is over there. It's already installed. And there is one little difference here. There's this little bracket, we have it hanging right now. So what this does apparently, and I didn't know this, I just figured it out because of the instructions, that's what they say. It's a headlight leveling sensor. So based on the height of the rear of the truck, it will adjust the headlights accordingly. Or at least that's what the name of the sensor suggests. I don't see any other use for it, but anyways, that's what this is. I've seen this kind of sensor on, say, the GX470s, 460s, where they have airbags and they use this to know exactly where they're at in terms of height for the rear. So pretty interesting to see it here for that purpose, for the headlight adjustment purpose. That little bracket that holds the brake lines there, I removed it to just make some slack on the lines and make sure that we're not pulling anything when lowering the axle. So we have a jack under the axle, 17 mil here to remove the bottom shock bolt. Sway bar is also a 17 mil, we have to undo that. And then here we have a 19 mil, and we have to undo this one in order to get enough clearance to remove the spring and put the spacer and put the spring back on. So when you undo this, make sure you're doing it from this side, the bolt side, not the nut side. This nut has, it's a little special. It's got a little indentation in here that matches the frame, and then it keeps the nut from spinning. So if you force this off, you're gonna be stripping those indentations, and then you're gonna turn this into a regular nut where it's not supposed to be. So just leave this alone, undo the bolt side, and this should be spinning just fine. This one is also gonna be a lot tighter if you try to move it. I know because I did it a long time ago and I learned my lesson. So we're gonna give it a little bit of help by raising the axle, and then we can push this out, maybe. Okay, there we go. And now we can start lowering the axle now that we have the sway bar off, shock, and then this loose. Axle's coming down. You still want to be careful with your lines and everything you have going on here. Make sure to always keep an eye on everything. And if you ever feel like you're pulling anything a little too much, just make sure to undo the bracket. I feel like this one could be getting there. I don't want to risk anything. Axle is still coming down and we don't even need it to. It just gives it a lot more space to put the spacer on. It just makes it super easy to actually get to the spring, remove it. And even with a spacer, after it's a little bit taller, it's still gonna be easy to put back on. Spacer goes right on top. So it's got this little cone, this tapered edge here. That's gonna go right in here. Sits perfectly. So the axle on this side came a lot lower than the right side, just by itself. You can still, if you need a little more space, you can easily just push it a little, but in this case, it's not even necessary, nor was it necessary on the other side. So that makes it a lot easier. This is pretty self-explanatory, but you do want to make sure that over here, the spring and the spacer is falling into the indentation. Also, you want to make sure that the spring is seated right at the bottom. You have this little edge here where the edge of the spring should be sitting on, right there. So this edge on the spring seat, that's where the spring should end. If it's anywhere else, just rotate it before you tighten up the suspension. Rotate it so that it sits right there. But that's pretty self-explanatory. Usually it just sits right the first time because it naturally falls into place, but just make sure to look at that before you button everything up. So now we're back in business. We have the sway bar installed, we have the bottom shock installed, we have this one is not tight yet. We are gonna tighten that down once we drop the car. This is supposed to be tightened up once you have the car on its weight. But this little guy has to go. It's just 3 12mm bolts. Factory bump stop, and we're gonna replace it with our new color matched bump stop. As you can see, this bracket for the bump stop has a little raised edge right here, and the reason is, this is where the bump stop will be mounted, and it's got this weld right here. It just compensates for this like step down here. Raised edge is gonna go on the outside of the frame where it makes sense. And that's what the bump stop will look like. Nothing special, just the make sure the raised edge goes on the outside of the frame. Again, and this is the only thing that makes sense. So if you put it backwards, it's like, you know, come on. So we are pretty much done with the rear. Now, I don't know if I showed you the wheels that we're gonna be using, but gloss black that match the bump stops for sure. And then 35s over here. Or I think these are actually 305s. 305 70 18, so these are 18s on 305s. I think that translates to a 34 something, 34.5 or something like that. I'll put it down on the screen, but close to 35s. It's still much bigger than stock tire, so it's gonna look badass. Last thing will be to put the skid plate back on, tighten the cam bolts, tighten the arm in the back, and then, okay, so we're actually all set now. It looks amazing, and we're ready to take it out for a quick spin. Just make sure that everything's right. The tire will rub. I turned it, actually, let me show you. Already hitting right here, so I'm gonna remove this little piece of plastic. Yeah, it's also rubbing in the front. This is pretty significant offset. I think these are 18 offset, so they're sticking out pretty significantly. I removed a bunch of trim pieces to try to make the tires fit. Hopefully it's a little better, but it doesn't take away from the amazing looks. And that's actually gonna wrap it up for the day. We're gonna wait till tomorrow to have some daylight, take some good pictures, good videos, good clips, and just really get a feel of what this looks like and drives like. But we'll talk about that tomorrow. It's a new day at the shop and the Land Cruiser is almost done. Look at this freaking thing. We still, however, have a little bit of a problem. Also, cloth seats, pretty interesting fabric going on here, and the whole thing is the same. There's no accent colors, there's no anything. I'm not saying that's good or bad, it's just pretty interesting look. Anyways, if we go all the way to the right, we still have, you probably heard it right there, we still have a little bit of rubbing. There's some rubbing here, and then on the back side we have this block right here. However, this is removable, so it's like an instant cab mount chop. It's just 3 bolts. This whole piece comes out, so that's easy to fix. I didn't think of it yesterday. I should have done it when I had it on the lift. But the front, this is all just plastic. It's easy to cut. It's just, it kind of hurts because it's a brand new truck, so it hurts to be cutting it up, but we're already doing so much to it. It's also not ours, so not our call to make, but if the owner wants to, we will be cutting a little bit of the plastic in front just to get rid of the rubbing altogether. So to remove this piece, there's 3 bolts, 17 mil. That's 1, 2, 3, and then this whole piece comes out, giving us a lot of extra clearance there for the tire. So this is before, this is after. There's a lot of extra space. So it's kind of like an instant cap mount chop. It's really nice that we don't have to be cutting any metal there. I guess if you go with 37s or something, but you know, at that point you have to be willing to do a lot of work to make them fit. 35s or 34 something, they fit pretty good. You just remove that, maybe cut a little bit of plastic. All right, so I'm in the Land Cruiser and I'm in my spot for tire rubbing issue test ground, which is this just bare, empty parking lot space. And that's why we're here. So it's still rubbing, but it's definitely a lot less than before, and it's only doing it in reverse. If you're driving forward, you can go full lock one side, full lock to the other. That block of metal that I just removed, definitely necessary to do. Otherwise, no chance. It was rubbing hard on that piece, but that's easy, 3 bolts, and it comes out instant cap mount chop. So there you go. That's the hardest part. The front, what you hear now is just plastic. So that's gonna be easy to take care of, but I wanted to make sure that it's necessary before I even attempt to do anything. If I go on reverse, I think, yeah, I'm still hearing it on the right side. I'm still hearing it on the left. I don't think an alignment's gonna do too much to save that because it hasn't been aligned just yet. But the alignment, if anything, will give you an extra degree of caster or something. It's not gonna help it not rub in the front. If anything, it's gonna make it worse. Also, we wouldn't wanna be just driving around knowing that it's so close. If the alignment fixed it, then we know it's just barely clearing. So as soon as you go off-roading or do anything else, it's gonna start, you know, doing a whole mess. Honestly, driving forward, very, very drivable, barely any rubbing. Not to say you should just ignore it, but you know, it's not too much. It's much bigger tires and the wheels have significant offset, and yet there's barely any rubbing, and the rubbing is just on plastic. That's so nice of Toyota to do that with a new truck. So the new generation, the 4Runner, I'm assuming the 4Runner too, we hadn't seen it, but the new Tacos, Land Cruisers, they all have that same situation in the front. You can fit much bigger tires without too much of a hassle. So thank you Toyota for that. As far as the drive, I've been going around. There's a bunch of speed bumps here, and it rides pretty nice. I do think it's a little bit stiffer, and that's just the nature of it. We're giving it preload, and we're also putting a spacer on top of the strut, so that makes sense. But I do believe it's just a little bit stiffer, not uncomfortable by any means. So both front and rear, they feel, if anything, a little tighter. Some people even prefer that feel. I'm not sure off-roading. We have not taken it off-road, nor are we going to, because it's not our truck. We're just gonna, you know, make sure everything's ready to go off-road, but I don't think we're gonna do that unless we go with the owner, maybe. Yeah, it's really not uncomfortable at all. It's super smooth still, as we expect from obviously a brand new truck. So it should be smooth and it should be nice. But yeah, some people are just completely against spacer lifts because they ruin the ride quality. In this case, I wouldn't say that's what's happening here. It's a little bit different, but it's not bad at all. It's perfectly comfortable, perfectly drivable every day. You go over speed bumps and it still feels like it eats them up. That's also in part because of the big tire. And that's been it for today's video. I'm gonna leave you with some cool shots of the Land Cruiser, but this thing is badass. I love it. Land Cruiser is probably my favorite Toyota product as of right now, even more than the Taco. I know I should be ashamed of myself for saying that, but it's just such a cool truck, especially when you put 35s on it, you lift it, you do all that stuff. Now, to be fair, I do drive a GX470, which is basically the older version of this car, which is a 250, the Prado, the Land Cruiser Prado. So it makes sense that I prefer this, but I know being a taco garage, the face of the taco garage, and I say that, I'm sorry, I do feel like a traitor, but it's just so cool. It's just so freaking cool. So in conclusion, READYLIFT for the Land Cruiser. It's pretty good. It's a spacer lift. It's nothing super special. It is a little bit of a different install than others, especially with this preload spacer that goes on top of the spring, but mostly the same as any other spacer lift. Works pretty well. All the parts are there. All the parts are high quality. Still, if you have the money, and that's also if you're really trying to off-road and if you're really trying to do some serious off-roading, maybe get Kings, maybe get something else. For anything else, this is more than enough. It rides well and it gives you the space for the massive tires right there. So I hope you learned something. I hope you liked the video. I hope you liked the Land Cruiser, and I'll see you in the next one.